The lantern has been burning for hours. Somewhere in the dark, a man is sitting with his back against a wooden post, not sleeping. His armor is resting beside him, not stowed, not packed away, but close, within arm's reach. The ground is cold, damp where the frost has begun to settle. The mat beneath him is thin. He can hear wind moving through the camp, and somewhere further away, horses shifting in the dark, restless for reasons no one can explain. Tomorrow, there will be violence. He knows this with the same certainty that he knows the weight of the sword across his lap. This is not a scene from a legend. It is a practical situation, one that thousands of samurai experienced across centuries of Japanese warfare, from the chaos of the Sengoku period to earlier campaigns in the Kamakura and Muromachi eras. The night before battle was not a moment of poetic reflection arranged for posterity. It was a logistical reality, a physical ordeal, and a social event shaped by rank, obligation, weather, and the grinding uncertainty of what morning would bring. What actually happened in that space between sunset and dawn, when armies had stopped moving, when the fighting had not yet begun, is a question worth taking seriously, because the answer cuts through layers of idealized imagery and arrives at something more textured, more human, and in many ways more compelling than the mythology ever was. To understand the night before battle, you have to understand what preceded it. Japanese warfare during the high periods of samurai conflict, particularly the 15th and 16th centuries, was not like cinema suggests. Armies moved along roads, through mountain passes, across river crossings in rain. They traveled on foot and on horseback, with enormous logistical tales of retainers, porters, pack animals, and camp followers. A major campaign could involve weeks of movement before any engagement occurred, and by the time two forces were genuinely positioned to fight, the men involved had already been sleeping badly, eating inconsistently, and carrying heavy equipment for days or weeks at a stretch. Armor alone was a significant physical burden. A full suit of Japanese lamellar armor could weigh anywhere from 15 to 30 kilograms depending on the period and style. The lacquered plates, the shoulder guards, the chest protection, the layered skirt sections protecting the thighs and lower body, all of it had to be carried or worn. And unlike European plate armor, which was often rigid and self-supporting, traditional Japanese armor involved large amounts of silk or leather lacing that connected the plates. That lacing absorbed moisture. It held sweat. After days on the road in summer heat or autumn rain, the lacing could become stiff and chafed. The samurai arriving at camp the night before a battle was not arriving fresh. He was arriving worn. This matters because the physical condition of a warrior on the eve of battle shaped everything that followed: how he slept, what he ate, what rituals he performed, and how functional he would be the next morning. The romanticized image of a samurai sitting in perfect composure the night before combat is not false exactly, but it is incomplete. It describes a possible state of mind while omitting the body that contained it. Camp arrangements varied significantly depending on rank, the size of the force, and the terrain. A high-ranking commander might have access to a commandeered building, a temple, or at minimum a proper tent with wooden flooring and a brazier for warmth. Lower-ranking samurai and their foot soldiers, the ashigaru, who formed the bulk of most armies, had no such luxury. They slept on the ground, on thin mats or folded blankets, under basic shelters when available, or simply under the open sky when they were not. The scene that opens this subject captures something accurate. One man standing, unable or unwilling to rest, drinking from a flask in the cold air, and another lying flat on a mat with his sword close enough to grab without sitting up. That is not a dramatic composition invented for effect. It reflects a genuine tension within military camps. Not everyone slept, not everyone could. Watch rotations were a practical necessity, and those on watch stood in the dark, responsible for detecting any movement from the enemy. In larger encampments, retainers and lower soldiers cycled through shifts. For samurai of significant rank, personal retainers might manage the watch, while the warrior himself attempted to rest, but the proximity of weapons remained. You did not place your sword across the room when battle was expected before dawn. Temperature played a significant role in all of this. Japan's climate varies sharply by season and region, and campaigns happened in all of them. A winter camp before a battle in the mountains north of Kyoto was an entirely different physical experience than a humid summer encampment in the lowlands near Osaka. Cold entered wooden structures quickly. Paper screens offered privacy but not insulation. Braziers provided limited heat, and their smoke collected in the upper space of any enclosed area. Men sleeping on the floor slept closest to the cold air that pooled near ground level. This was the architectural and thermal reality of the structures available to them. Food was one of the more carefully considered elements of pre-battle preparation, at least at the level of military planning. The standard field rations centered on dried or cooked rice. Onigiri, rice balls compressed and sometimes wrapped in dried seaweed, were portable, calorie-dense, and required no preparation beyond initial cooking. Dried fish, pickled vegetables, and miso-based preparations supplemented the rice and provided salt, which mattered under heavy physical exertion. The night before battle was sometimes an occasion for a more deliberate meal, not elaborate by civilian standards, but intentional. Surviving accounts describe samurai consuming specific foods as part of pre-battle custom. The combination of rice with abalone, kelp, and chestnuts appears in historical and literary references as a ceremonially auspicious pre-battle meal. These foods were not chosen for flavor alone. Each carried symbolic associations with strength, longevity, or victory, and consuming them before combat was a small ritual embedded in practical eating. Whether a given warrior had access to such provisions depended entirely on rank and supply situation. For many lower-ranking fighters, the pre-battle meal was whatever was available, likely cold rice and dried provisions that had survived the march. Fires in camp carried their own set of considerations. A large number of fires visible at night could reveal the position or size of a force to a watching enemy. Military commanders were sometimes careful about fire discipline, though enforcement varied by period and situation. Ticking typically happened in the earlier evening. Food was distributed, and fires were reduced before full darkness. Sake was present in some pre-battle contexts, though its role has been both exaggerated and oversimplified. Small amounts had a recognized place in ritual contexts, including ceremonies performed by commanders and senior warriors. Drinking to excess was regarded as genuinely problematic, and military manuals from the Sengoku era warned against it directly. What the historical record more consistently shows is controlled, symbolic use of alcohol within ritual frameworks, not indulgence. Ritual was inseparable from the military culture of the samurai class, and the night before battle was saturated with it. But ritual here does not mean theatrical ceremony divorced from function. The rituals performed before combat were understood as genuinely connected to outcome, as acts that influenced the disposition of the gods, the character of fate, and the warrior's own psychological preparation. Prayer was common, and the specific form it took depended on religious affiliation. The samurai class drew from both Shinto and Buddhist practice, often holding both simultaneously without contradiction. Prayers to Hachiman, the war deity most widely venerated in samurai religious culture, were offered at portable shrines or simply directed upward in the darkness of a camp. Buddhist invocations of the Amida Buddha, associated with death and rebirth, also appeared in the pre-battle context. For a warrior facing genuine probability of death, these were not perfunctory gestures. They were serious transactions with forces that his entire cultural framework told him were real. Some warriors composed death poems, jisei, farewell verses written in expectation that the battle ahead might be the last thing they did. The practice was more common among higher-ranking and more literate samurai, but it was not limited to commanders. The poems that survive vary enormously in character. Some are genuinely moving expressions of resignation. Others are formulaic, clearly written quickly by someone going through expected motions. The practice itself matters more than any individual poem because it shows how the samurai class had developed a specific cultural technology for confronting the nearness of death. You named it, you framed it in language, and you moved on. Weapons and armor received careful attention that night. A sword exposed to rain on the road needed drying. The blade required wiping with clean cloth, and in some cases the application of oil to prevent rust. A suit of armor with damaged lacing required repair or, at minimum, assessment. A broken lacing on a shoulder guard left unaddressed could fail under the stress of combat and leave a gap in protection that mattered. Bows required checking for string tension, especially after wet weather. Arrows needed to be counted. None of this was ceremonial. It was practical maintenance performed by men who understood that their equipment was the difference between surviving the next morning and not. The social dimension of the night before battle is often overlooked in accounts that focus on the individual warrior. Samurai did not fight alone. They fought within hierarchies, within relationships of obligation that defined who they were and how they behaved. The night before battle was a context in which command structures were reinforced, orders communicated, and the social fabric of the military unit actively maintained. Senior commanders received their officers. The organization of the next day's engagement, who would advance first, what signal would begin the attack, and which unit held which position had to be communicated and confirmed. These conversations happened in the hours before sleep by lantern light in a command tent or the largest available structure. For the men receiving their orders, this was also a moment of reading their commander's state. A general who appeared calm and purposeful projected stability into the ranks below him. The management of visible composure was therefore not merely a personal matter for senior samurai, it was a military function. Below the level of command, within smaller groups of retainers and soldiers, the night before battle was a time of informal gathering. Men who had marched together, shared rations, and slept near each other for weeks were now facing the same danger together. The conversations that happened in those hours were not recorded for history, but the human reality of men sitting in the dark, talking quietly before a day of violence, is a basic feature of military life in any period. Practical knowledge, the weak points in an enemy's defensive line, the best approach to a river crossing, the fastest escape route if things went badly, was shared in the informal spaces between orders and sleep. Sleep itself was not a passive withdrawal from the situation. For warriors expecting combat at dawn, the management of rest was a practical calculation. Exhaustion in battle was a serious tactical problem. A fighter who had not rested moved more slowly, made worse decisions, and tired faster under the physical demands of close combat. But sleeping too heavily in a context where sudden movement might be required was also dangerous. Men in less secure positions, skirmish units, advance parties positioned close to the enemy, slept with a portion of their attention still engaged, in the way anyone in an uncertain environment learns to do. The depth of sleep available depended heavily on rank. A lord inside a commandeered building on a proper sleeping surface with retainers managing the watch outside had access to something resembling genuine rest. A foot soldier lying on the ground in the open, cold and possibly hungry, had something far less. The samurai in the middle of the hierarchy occupied a middle ground, some protection, some organizational support, but also specific personal responsibilities that the soldiers below him did not share. Armor was not worn to sleep, at least not in most documented contexts. The physical discomfort of sleeping in a full suit of Japanese lamellar armor would have been severe, and the practical problems of circulation and temperature regulation while wearing it made genuine rest nearly impossible. The armor came off, or at minimum was loosened, but it stayed close. The act of donning armor before battle was a staged process that required assistance from retainers and took meaningful time. Preparing before dawn in the dark, quickly and without error, was something samurai trained for. The retainer who helped his master into armor before a battle was performing a specific skill that had been practiced many times. There's a tension at the center of all of this that the popular image of the samurai almost never captures. The coexistence of deliberate ritual refinement with physical hardship so ordinary it barely merited description. The samurai class had developed over centuries an elaborate culture of aesthetic engagement, with poetry, with tea ceremony, with the performance of composed behavior under pressure. This culture was real. It was not decoration layered over a brutal military reality. It was deeply integrated into how samurai understood themselves and their obligations. But it existed inside bodies that were tired, cold, damp, and afraid. The warrior who composed a death poem by firelight was also a man whose back ached from days of riding,
whose feet had blisters from march conditions, whose stomach was unsettled from weeks of inadequate food. The ritual composure described in historical accounts was not achieved by transcending the body. It was practiced in spite of it, alongside it, through it. This is what makes the samurai tradition more interesting and more human than the mythology allows. The discipline was real precisely because the difficulty was real. The night before battle was not a romantic interlude between a warrior and his fate. It was a specific set of hours in which a man managed his body, his equipment, his relationships, his obligations, and his fear, in roughly that order and often simultaneously. The lantern burned down, the camp grew quieter. Someone on watch stood at the edge of the firelight looking outward into the dark, and somewhere behind him another man lay on a mat with a sword within reach, and whatever sleep came to him, came. What survives in the historical record from these hours is fragmentary. The death poem found in a warrior's effects, the pre-battle ceremony recorded in a clan chronicle, the war diary that describes rations and route but says nothing about what the night felt like from the inside. The silence in the record is itself informative. These were men living a military life that they understood as duty and service, not as spectacle. The night before battle was not something they narrated for an audience. It was something they endured, prepared through, and moved past. What we can reconstruct of that experience is detailed enough to be meaningful and honest enough to resist the mythology built around it later. The Bushido Code, as popularly understood, is largely a Meiji-era and 20th century construction shaped by nationalism and the deliberate idealization of an earlier warrior culture for modern purposes. The samurai who lay down in a camp in 1575 was not thinking about a code. He was thinking about the morning. He was checking whether his sword was dry. He was listening to the horses. That is the reality, and in its specificity, it is more powerful than any legend. If you want to go deeper into the material life of the samurai, the food they carried, the roads they traveled, the weapons they maintained, the next video takes that world apart, piece by piece.